Joshua 1 through 9. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord spoke to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' assistant, saying, My servant Moses is dead. Now proceed to cross the Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I am giving to them, to the Israelites. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you, as I promised to Moses. From the wilderness and the Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites to the great sea and the west shall be your territory. No one shall be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not fail you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall put this people in possession of the land that I swore to their ancestors to give them. Only be strong and very courageous, being careful to act in accordance with all the law that my servant Moses commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, so that you may be successful wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart out of your mouth. You shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to act in accordance with all that is written in it. For then you shall make your way prosperous, and then you shall be successful. I hereby command you, be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened or dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Not long ago, there was a story circulating called A Bricklayer's Very Bad Day. A brick mason was writing to his boss about an event that happened recently, and here's how it begins. Dear sir, when I got to the top of the building, I noticed that the hurricane had knocked down some bricks off the top. So I rigged up a beam with a pulley at the top of the building and hoisted up a couple of barrels of bricks. When I had fixed the damaged spot, there were a lot of bricks left over. So I hoisted the barrel back up again and secured the line at the bottom, and then went up and filled the barrel with the extra bricks. Then I went down to the bottom and cast off the rope to begin lowering the barrel of bricks. Unfortunately, the barrel of bricks was heavier than I was. And before I knew what was happening, the barrel started down, jerking me up. Afraid to let go, I decided to hang on. Halfway up, I met the barrel coming down fast. And I received a severe blow on my shoulder and several scrapes and cuts on my arm. I then continued to the top, banging my head against the beam and getting my fingers jammed in the pulley, causing more cuts and bruises. When the barrel hit the ground, it burst its bottom, allowing all the bricks to spill out. I was now heavier than the barrel, and so started down again at high speed. Halfway down, I met the barrel coming up fast and received severe injuries to my shins. When I hit the ground, I landed on a pile of bricks, getting several painful cuts from the sharp edges. At this point, I must have lost my presence of mind because I let go of the rope. The barrel came down fast, giving me a very heavy blow on the head and putting me in the hospital. Therefore, I respectfully request sick leave. Some days just don't go as planned, do they? Even when you're trying to be helpful, and sometimes life doesn't go as planned, even when you're trying really hard to make it go right. We live in an unpredictable world where bad things happen. Sometimes bad things happen at the hands of other people, well-intentioned people. Sometimes bad things happen because that's just the way life is. And sometimes because we make a mistake, or sometimes because we're actually trying to do something really, really hard. But few people, especially the older we get, would say that life is easy. Scott Peck, in his famous book, The Road Less Traveled, has sold millions of copies, started with these 3 words: life is difficult. So when we read in our text, "For the Lord your God is with you wherever you go, and I will not fail you or forsake you," we sometimes put in there what we think it's saying, or what we want to hear, or what we want to believe, that life will be easy and always go your way. But this whole section here at the beginning of the book of Joshua is a preparation for the difficulty and the hardship for what was coming for the nation of Israel as they made this next step across the Jordan River into the Promised Land. The reassurance of God's presence was necessary because of the hardship they were about to face. Joshua had been around for a long time. You remember Joshua? Joshua was probably about 60 years old, we calculate, by this time. He was very young. He was one of those young kids that came out of Egypt when they were released from slavery. And after these 400 years of slavery. They crossed the Red Sea, and immediately the nation goes to Mount Sinai, where Moses receives the law, and the people become a nation there at Mount Sinai. Then Moses sends 12 spies. I don't know if you remember this. He sends 12 spies up into Canaan, the Promised Land. One from each tribe. And they go up into the Promised Land and take a look and scout it out to bring a report back to Moses. The land that God was giving them. 10 of the 12 spies return and say, those guys are huge. The people are powerful. Cities well fortified. They said, we felt like grasshoppers compared to them. There's no way we can win. This is a dumb idea. We shouldn't go. 2 of them said, we can do it. Joshua and Caleb. Let's go. We're ready. The land is good, flowing with milk and honey. This is exactly how we pictured it. We can do this. Come on, let's go. So what made the difference? Why did 10 say, these guys are huge, we'll never make it, we're going to fail? 2 guys said, let's go. Let's go now. 10 of them were still thinking like slaves. 10 of them were still thinking like victims. 10 of them were still feeling and thinking small. For 400 years, they had been made to feel weak and victimized, enslaved. Joshua and Caleb saw life differently. They were looking through the eyes of the recent deliverance. They were remembering their freedom and escape from Egypt. They were focused on what was possible, but the people forgot. They thought that moment of deliverance, that escape from Egypt was some kind of a fluke. Who they really were slaves. Who they really were victims. Yeah, they had that moment of victory, but even a broken clock's right twice a day. I mean, so it was just luck, right? Just luck. Not Joshua and Caleb. Joshua and Caleb said, this is who we really are. This escape from Egypt is who we really are. This victory is who we are as God's people. It's the slavery that was the aberration. 10 remembered their slavery and only saw the bad odds and the obstacles. 2 remembered the recent deliverance and the victory and saw amazing possibilities. The people believed the 10. The people sided with the 10 because the 10 were able to produce enough fear, enough hesitation, that they said, we better not go. We better not try. It took 40 years for that generation of impossible odds, those who could only see themselves as victims. It took 40 years for them to finally die off, and a new generation of risk-taking dreamers to take their place. That's what the 40 years was about, 40 years until finally a new generation could come that could make some different choices. The problem, you see, was that they weren't willing to try to do anything about it. They weren't willing to take a risk and maybe make some change. Their victim attitude paralyzed them. They'd been through a lot. They'd been generations of being enslaved. It's just a reality of what happens when you're told you're nothing for a long, long time. They chose the desert. They said, we'd rather stay here in the desert where we don't have any food or water than risk going into the land of milk and honey. In fact, you could read it, they actually were thinking, I wonder if the door's still open for us to go back to Egypt. Maybe Pharaoh would allow us back into get our old jobs back. How often we can do this in our own lives. We can say it's just too hard. Enemy's too strong. Obstacles too high. I don't have what it takes. I can't do it. Choosing slavery over the possibility of freedom. And then we pretend we don't really want to do that anyway. We're happy here. One good way to know what you'd really like to do, what's really in your heart to do. You want to know one way to really know what you'd really like to do? Ask yourself, what would I do if it wasn't hard? And when you answer that question, you're getting close to what's in your heart. So often we alter what's in our heart to do simply because we think it's impossible. And so finally we get to Joshua 1. We hear God say to Joshua 3 times. So Joshua must have really been afraid. 3 times it's repeated. Be strong and courageous, Joshua. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not fail you or forsake you. 3 times. Be strong and courageous. Then again in verse 7. Only be strong and courageous. Then one more time in verse 9. Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened or dismayed. And it's not, do not feel fear. Because we don't have any control over that. That's just our feelings. We're going to feel feelings. All sorts of them. Feel uncertain, feel afraid, nervous, all those things. The phrase means just don't act on it. Just don't give in to it. Just don't change your plans because of it. Just don't run. Joshua. You, Joshua, will be the new leader. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. You can imagine how hard this must have been for Joshua. He'd been this assistant for all these years. He'd seen what Moses has gone through. You know, the worst thing about being I'm not a pastor's kid, which is probably why I went skipping and jumping into the ministry. But those who have been raised as pastors' kids sometimes, they know what's in store. And other areas of vocation as well. When you know what's in store, it makes it much more difficult, much harder in many respects. You can imagine what it must have been like for Joshua to take over for a legend like Moses. How much self-doubt he must have had. How unprepared or unqualified he must have felt. But you know what? That's the way it is for all of us. There's not one person who's at the beginning or in the middle of anything who doesn't feel unprepared or unqualified. And unfortunately, we're always at the beginning or in the middle of something. Always. And so we too need courage and bravery. We too need to be strong. But if you look around, and if you look within, you will see inspiring acts of bravery to lean on, to rest in, and to be inspired by. They're all over. Sometimes we think they were just flukes if they're our lives, our stories. But I guarantee they weren't flukes. Maybe this is what Memorial Day is really about. Maybe we should rename it Courage Day or Bravery Day. That's what we're thinking about. Bravery, courage. When I think of courage, when I think about courage, I think about Irena Sendler. When the Nazis invaded her native Poland and rounded up all the Jews into a walled-in ghetto, Sendler knew what was going to happen. She was a social worker and got credentials as a nurse so she could sneak food and medicine into the ghetto when she went in to care for the sick. But what she snuck out was much more phenomenal. It's estimated that Sendler and her group who helped her got approximately 2,500 children out of the ghetto. Sedated and placed in the bottom of toolboxes or lined in burlap sacks at the bottom of her truck, and sent them through a network of like-minded comrades to Christian orphanages where they were given new identities and new homes. 2,500. She kept their real names in a jar buried in her backyard. She was eventually caught by the Nazis who imprisoned and tortured her, breaking both of her legs. And when the war ended, she gave the rest of her life to trying to reunite as many of those children as she could to their families. That's bravery. But bravery exists among all of you. Every time I do a memorial service and hear stories like I heard this last week of Jolene Conity, I hear stories of courage and bravery throughout her life. I can't help but think of our own Edrin as a story of courage. Some of you know Edrin's story. Boarded a plane so many years ago to come to this country to begin a new life, because life had taken a dramatic and painful turn for him and his family in Uganda when his father was killed. Traveled as a student on a student visa here to Sacramento. 2 days in the airport in England. He lived on cups of hot water because he had no money for food. Had one pair of pants, one shirt, and one sweater to his name. Fear was intense, as was uncertainty. But somehow, in the midst of impossible odds, by taking one step at a time, he survived. And that courage and bravery continues to flow through his life today toward others. Relied on the compassion of others who helped him along the way, which caused him now to want to be that person of compassion for someone else. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the willingness to act in the face of it. It is the willingness to take a risk despite the feelings of uncertainty and doubt. Or to quote the famous cowboy John Wayne, courage is being scared to death and saddling up anyway. The problem in the wilderness wasn't that the children of Israel felt afraid. We all would expect they would feel afraid. I mean, they were fortified cities up in Canaan. That wasn't the problem. The problem was they decided not to go. That was the problem. They decided that the journey was too far, too long, too hard. Better to stay put. We might fail, so better not to try. So how does Joshua now respond? Just as he responded 40 years earlier, the same way. We read that Joshua commanded the officers of the people, saying, pass through the midst of the camp. Command the people, saying, prepare provisions for yourselves, for within 3 days you are to cross this Jordan, to go to possess the land which the Lord your God has given you to possess it. Joshua swallows hard and finally gets to say, let's go do this. So I ask you, What is at the doorstep for you today? What promised land are you being called to inhabit today? You may have not thought about it in this way, but there's something. There's something for each one of us. There's a Jordan River that we are each being asked to cross today. Something that's giving you pause. Something that can create fear. Bravery and courage and strength is what it takes to take that first step. You know, take your first step into the river. What's that step that we've been avoiding? Because we don't know what the outcome might be. Is it a phone call? Is it signing up for a class? Is it joining the group? Is it writing that letter? What is calling you? I hope you haven't stopped listening. What's calling you? One of the ways we act together as a congregation is to support one another's dreams and plans and calling. It's called encouragement. You hear the word courage in there? Encouragement. Helping each other have courage. One of the ways God shows His encouraging presence to us is through the presence of each other. Where we look outward toward the promised land, not just inward towards our fears and hesitations. Where we're not paying attention to what we're afraid of. Man, we can get so used to thinking about those things we're afraid of. The church was not called to be a barricade against the world. It was not called to protect ourselves against all the evil out there, build up the high walls where we can hide behind them. But rather, the church was called to be a launching pad for how we will go out into the world to represent the good news of God's love and value for all. So here's an idea. If you're having a hard time answering any of these questions, here's an idea. Tell 3 people this week how their courage has encouraged you in your life. 3 people. You all know at least 3 stories of courage around you, among your friends or children or family or whoever. 3 people. Pick out 3 people. Give them a call. Write them a letter. Or if you know how, send a text. 3 people. And be as specific as you can. That hardship you faced, that pain you've endured, that task you took on, that strengthened me. That encouraged me. Thank you. 3 people. It'll do 2 things. It will remind them so they don't forget. So they can have courage for the next thing. Sometimes we forget those times where we were courageous. And it will strengthen you. So when we're faced with our rivers to cross, our promised lands to inhabit, we don't want to be like the 10. We don't want to be full of good excuses or all the reasons why we're not enough. We want to be like Joshua and Irena and Edrin and Jolene and so many others. We want to face the fear and the uncertainty, and we want to be able to say to ourselves and to whoever will come with us, let's go do this. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.